Oh, I should have jumped to the slide earlier. Here's a picture of the stomach, and stomach, top to bottom, here's the esophagus. So up here somewhere would be the mouth. Esophagus. Here's the esophageal sphincter, where the food's actually being allowed to enter the stomach, if the hole is big enough. And then in your stomach, here, zoom in, is what the actual inside of your stomach looks like. It's these big waves. It almost looks like a canyon or some real rough landscape. And these folds are the rugae. So these big folds we see here are the rugae. They increase the surface area of the stomach and allow us to have lots of regions where there are chief cells and parietal cells making their digestive enzymes and their stomach acid. The exact zoom that I want. It's good enough for now. And the food goes from the cardia and antrum region of the stomach. The regions of the stomach aren't important for you guys to know, but we can divide up the stomach into basically 4 big regions. The end of it is what we call the pylorus. This is where food exits, and it exits through another sphincter known as the pyloric sphincter. This is a really important sphincter because keep in mind the fluid in the stomach is mostly a mix of water, hydrochloric acid, and enzymes that has a really low pH. Everything else, everything before the stomach and everything after the stomach, can't really handle a pH that's any lower than like 6 or 7. We need a nice high pH in order to not burn the inside of our digestive tract. And the pyloric sphincter serves an important function here in allowing only enough food and juice to come out of the stomach at a time. So the esophageal sphincter serves an important role to allow only certain amounts of food in at a time and not allow acid to come back up. The pyloric sphincter limits how much food comes out of the stomach at the same time. And while we didn't go into detail on the layers of the stomach has 3 major muscular layers that all contract in different directions to allow this to just be a big mixing pot. This is what, if I was to zoom in on the rugae, in fact, if I was to zoom in over here and look deep inside one of these folds all the way down to the cellular level, you would see something that looks like this. This is a gastric pit, or a cross-section of a part of the stomach mucosa, which shows the gastric pit. So I mentioned that the stomach produces a mucus or mucosal layer. That's this big layer right here. This layer is protective for the rest of the stomach, the muscular layers of the stomach, and the serosa of the stomach. And inside of those valleys of the rugae are what we call gastric pits. Now the cells, which are these purple things here, that line the gastric pits are either mucus cells that produce mucus to protect the stomach, or they're chief cells, which make pepsinogen, which becomes pepsin, or they're parietal cells, which make hydrochloric acid. And there are a couple of other types of gastric cells that produce digestive hormones that we won't get too much into. But know that what's actually happening in the stomach is that you have folds, the rugae, and inside of the folds are these little pits. And inside of these pits is where the magic is happening, where the products are being produced to aid in digestion. And here's a picture or a video about alcohol, which I'm not going to play for you because it will not work on the screen recorder. So once we made it past the stomach, and let me jump back to a picture for you. Once we make it through the stomach, through the pyloric sphincter, we are in the small intestine. The first region of the small intestine is known as the duodenum. The small intestine is about 4.5 meters long. That's like 16 or 18 feet. It's a really long tube. Its diameter is very small, and so it takes food a long time to make it through because only a certain amount of food can fit in this small diameter tube, and the tube's really long. This is where food spends the majority of its time when you eat it. From the top, the mouth, down to the anus, the region of your alimentary canal where it spends the most time is the small intestine. It consists of 3 regions: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. So just know those three names. The only really important one is the duodenum as far as function. The duodenum is the first region, and that's where the chyme, again, the bolus of food mixed with stomach acid and stomach juice, the chyme from the stomach comes into the duodenum, as well as digestive enzymes and bicarbonate, which is coming from the pancreas. These juices come through the pancreatic duct, so a little hole in the side of the duodenum. And then we also have bile. Think back to the other accessory organs. Bile coming from the liver and from the gallbladder come through another duct and end up in the duodenum of the small intestine. So the first region of the small intestine, the duodenum, ends up receiving not only things from the stomach, the food that we eat, but also enzymes and juices from our liver, our gallbladder, and our pancreas. So this is what a cross-section, microscopic cross-section of the small intestine looks like. So the epithelial wall, epithelial refers to cells that are on the outside surface of something. So the epithelium of our digestive tract is the inner lining of it, whereas the epithelium of our skin is the outermost layer of our skin. The epithelial wall is covered with villi. Villi are these little... I think you can see it better in this picture. These little tentacle-like things. They kind of look like the fronds of a sea anemone. And they kind of wiggle and wave as in the water that's moving through them. And as chyme, food passes through the stomach. It passes along these folds. And food is absorbed when it comes into contact with one of these villi. Villi themselves, so this is a large individual villus, or plural villi. And each of these villi consist of little tiny microvilli, basically little versions of the same thing. And the function of the villi microvilli system is to increase the surface area. Remember, absorption is happening in this part of the digestive tract. And absorption is it's a surface process. It depends on the surface area. The higher the surface area, the faster the rate of absorption. Now, microvilli also participate in digestion because along the edge of the microvilli, we have enzymes embedded into their cell walls. That's what makes up what we call the brush border enzymes. So enzymes are also helping to digest, meaning that in the small intestine, we have both digestion and absorption happening. Now, accessory organs. We've talked mostly about food actually moving through a tube. This is not the case here. So the pancreas, your food never enters the pancreas. If food gets to your pancreas, you got big problems. The pancreas serves a couple of different functions. We'll look at the exocrine, or the digestive function first. It produces pancreatic fluid, which is made up of enzymes, these enzymes, and our bicarbonate buffer. So the enzymes that make it up include trypsin and chymotrypsin. These are proteins, or they are proteins. They're enzymes that help break down certain types of proteins. So trypsin and chymotrypsin are made up by the pancreas. We have pancreatic amylase. If you think back to salivary amylase, it helped us break down sugars. Pancreatic amylase, same thing. It helps us break down polysaccharides into shorter sugars. It just so happens that some types of sugars can't be broken down by salivary amylase, so the pancreas makes its own version. And then we have pancreatic lipases, which break down complex fats into free fatty acids and monoglycerides, individual glycerol units. And of course, the bicarbonate buffer that comes from the pancreas, the function of it is to neutralize the acid that comes from the stomach. So we have a real strong acid coming from the stomach. We've got a decently strong base in bicarbonate coming from the pancreas. They mix together and you neutralize and end up with water and all the salt and chyme and food bits that are floating around. So the next accessory organ that we care about is the liver. This is the body's largest internal organ. Your skin is actually considered a single organ, so our skin is our largest organ overall, but as far as inside of the body's largest organ is the liver. The liver secretes bile, remember it produces bile, and then it secretes it into the gallbladder. Bile pigments. Bile has kind of a notably greenish dark brown color. And bile pigments and bile salts are end products of bile interacting with certain types of fats. I'll talk about that in a second when we look at what happens with bile after the fact. But know that we make bile in the liver. The bile is secreted into the gallbladder. The gallbladder's job is to store and concentrate the bile. And the moment that your body eats fatty food, it can recognize that it ate fatty food. So if I have a burger and some french fries, my body can tell that I had a burger and french fries because it knows what fat looks like inside or at the cellular level. And when it recognizes fatty food, it triggers a reflex, both a neural reflex and an endocrine reflex mediated by cholecystokinin, in order to get the gallbladder to squeeze. And as the gallbladder contracts or squeezes, the bile that's stored in there shoots out of the gallbladder, goes down the cystic duct, and ends up in our duodenum in our small intestine. So we can tell when we eat fatty food internally, involuntarily, and release bile in order to make digestion happen. Digestion of fatty foods happen. Here's a good picture to talk about what's going on. So in this white space where my mouse is, this is where the stomach would be if it was drawn here. And the stomach, the pyloric sphincter would be about here, and it leads into the duodenum. This pink tube here is the duodenum, the first part of our small intestine. Wrapped up between the stomach and the duodenum is the pancreas, this white organ. And the pancreas produces those pancreatic enzymes, trypsin and chymotrypsin, pancreatic lipases, pancreatic amylase, and they go down this kind of yellowish white tube in the center of the pancreas. Eventually, they convalesce in this tube right here called the pancreatic duct, and they come out into the duodenum through that hole right there. The liver and the gallbladder do something similar. The liver shoots bile into the gallbladder. The gallbladder also shoots bile out once it feels the need, once it recognizes that we have eaten fatty foods. And all that bile comes through this duct right here known as the common bile duct. And the common bile duct is this green stalk that leads down here into the duodenum. So bile comes from the liver and the gallbladder into the duodenum. Pancreatic bicarbonate and pancreatic enzymes come through the pancreatic duct and enter the duodenum, and chyme from the stomach, which is over here, is coming into the duodenum. So all three of those things mix here. The duodenum is our first real mixing chamber. And here we have a cross-section of the pancreas. These functions we may talk about later if I get a chance to talk briefly about the endocrine system. But the pancreas has very small regions that serve endocrine functions instead of digestive functions. These are called pancreatic islet cells or islets of Langerhans. And inside of these islets, we have alpha cells, which make glucagon, a hormone, and then beta cells, which make insulin, another hormone, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute. Now, recognize that we've talked mostly about digestion up until this point, the chemical breakdown. Well, absorption, the process where food crosses a cell membrane, enters into our bloodstream, and then we have the nutrients in our blood, that involves active transport and facilitated diffusion, which are different cellular transport mechanisms. This is Bio 1 stuff, so I won't get too much into the details of it. But I want you guys to know that amino acids and monosaccharides are transported through epithelial cells in order to reach the blood and, in some cases, the liver. So the main thing here is understanding that our nutrients that we need, the amino acids, monosaccharides, simple fats, all those have to get into the bloodstream, and that happens through cellular transport, through active transport or facilitated diffusion. Fatty acids and monoglycerides are able to diffuse into epithelial cells. In other words, fats can move through the cell membrane from outside to in without any issues at all. They don't need to go through a special transporter in order to make it happen. Monoglycerides are a building block of complex fats. So the building blocks of fats, fatty acids and glycerol, can cross from one side of the cell into the other side through the cell membrane. And once they're inside the cell, they're reassembled first into triglycerides and then into things that we call chylomicrons. These are kind of floating balls of fat that float around our bloodstream and can be good or bad depending on the context. They get there first by going through the lymphatic system and then eventually the circulatory system. I won't have much time to talk about the lymphatic system in the context of the digestive system or in the context of the immune system for that regard, just because of what little material we have left to cover and what little time we have left to cover. But if I could jump back to this picture here, you'll see that lymphatic ducts, which are basically tubes that carry wastes, fats, and other products throughout the body. Lymphatic ducts are often, like the green here, are oftentimes right along a vein and artery. In fact, a lot of lymphatic ducts drain directly into a vein. So if I eat food that has fat in it, the fat is crossing through these small intestinal cells. They make it into a lymphatic vessel called a lacteal, and they make it to the lymphatic duct where they eventually drain into, say, a blue vein here, and then from the vein they make it back to the heart, enter an artery, and then are dispersed throughout the body. Jump back here. Know that the majority of fluid that we reabsorb happens in the small intestine. Almost all of the absorption happens in the small intestine. And here is a nice picture of what absorption looks like. So proteins, yeah, we'll stay out here. The screen recorder doesn't let me move some types of pictures around easily. So proteins, complex proteins or simple amino acids, can't cross the brush border. They can't cross these epithelial cells. And so they have to be transported through a special transport protein in order to make it through the epithelial cell and eventually enter the blood. Carbs, sugars, also can't cross. They're too polar, so they can't cross the cell membrane. They have to go through a special transport protein in order to move into the blood. Fats, if they're small enough, can move through the brush border without a special transporter. So you'll notice transport protein. For these guys, no transport protein. They just squeeze through the cell membrane and form what's called a chylomicron and then enter a lymphatic capillary where they eventually make it back to the bloodstream. Hard to get exactly the zoom that I want there. Large intestine. So once we make it through the small intestine, we go through the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum, which are just regions of the small intestine. The only one that I care about for the test is the duodenum. Then we make it to the large intestine, which is the next tube. This is a short tube. The names are a little weird. It's called the large intestine because it has a big fat diameter. It's a really big open tube, but it's not a very long tube. Remember, the small intestine is larger because it's all convoluted and wrapped up. It also has a very smooth surface. There are no villi in the large intestine, meaning no major absorption processes are happening. We're not going to see the absorption of proteins and carbs and sugars in the large intestine. No digestion is happening in the large intestine. We don't have enzymes breaking things down in the large intestine for the most part. We have some bacteria which do some small functions and maybe some big functions that we don't know too much about because the science is still in development with regards to how bacteria interact with our large intestine. But there's no digestion happening there. The main function of the large intestine is to reabsorb water. That is the main function of the large intestine. The other functions are absorbing whatever electrolytes are left behind, absorbing vitamin K, and to prepare waste for expulsion. So remember, the food that we ate was a beige ball of a bolus when it was in our esophagus. It became chyme when it was in our stomach and through our small intestine. We've sucked out the majority of the juice that's in that food. And now we're just getting rid of what water is left behind and what nutrients and electrolytes are left behind. And what we're producing looks a lot like poop at this point. This would be a good picture to look at the reflexes in the colon. The colon is the large intestine. It's another word for large intestine, but I won't play this. You can watch it on your own. Here's a picture of the small intestine down here in the center, and then the large intestine being this large tube that goes up, over, down, and eventually reaches the butt. The first region of the large intestine is called the cecum. The cecum is the large opening chamber of the large intestine. And the last region of the small intestine is called the ileum. So the region where the ileum connects to the cecum is known as the ileocecal valve. This is the valve that allows food to make it from the small intestine to the large intestine. On the other end of the cecum, away from where food should be going, is our appendix, which I wanted to do in fact, I still might try to make a discussion board focused around the function of the appendix. The appendix, broadly speaking, no real function. We call it a vestigial structure. But there's also research that indicates that perhaps the appendix serves an important function for the microflora, the bacteria that make up our large intestine. And this is called the ascending portion of the large intestine. This isn't important for your test, but you can break down the large intestine or the colon into the ascending colon from the cecum up, the transverse colon from this end of your body to the other end of your body, the descending colon from the left side, your anatomical left side, down, and then your sigmoid colon as it kind of curls over to the back, and then finally you have your rectum, and then at the end, where this white is faded here, you have the anus. So the large intestine is layered with a big, thick lawn of bacteria. We have millions of bacteria that live and reproduce within the large intestine. There's more bacteria inside of us than there are human cells. Now, in this large intestine, this is where you also see the compaction of what was chyme and is now feces, which is a nice scientific word for poop. Poop is compacted and passed to the rectum via peristalsis. So the same process that caused food to move down the esophagus is also causing food to move through the small intestine and the large intestine. The feces exits at the anus, and this happens through two sphincters. The first sphincter is a smooth muscle sphincter. Anytime you see the word smooth muscle, think involuntary. We don't usually or really ever have control over smooth muscle. Then we have a striated or skeletal muscle sphincter, which is a voluntary sphincter. So if you want to use the bathroom and you say, I want to poop, you can physically make yourself poop by opening and closing this sphincter, this striated muscular sphincter. But what people don't realize is that there's a second sphincter, the smooth muscle sphincter, that's involuntary. So when you feel like you have to poop, it's because this sphincter is already open, and your job is just to open the other one and get the feces out of your rectum. Why is poop brown? Well, we talked earlier about bile salts being produced by the liver, and as it turns out, bile salts that are produced by the liver mix together with a couple of other things in the body. So we have red blood cells that circulate around our bloodstream and serve a number of important functions. Those red blood cells have a shelf life. After a certain number of days, between 90 and 120 days usually, your red blood cells are pretty much done. They can't do their job effectively anymore, and your body gets rid of them. It sends them to the liver, where it harvests the hemoglobin in them because the hemoglobin's still useful, and it sends the rest of the cellular debris into the liver. The liver breaks down the remains of the red blood cells, and it forms a structure or a compound known as bilirubin. Bilirubin also gets secreted along with the bile salts through the common bile duct into your duodenum, your small intestine. And as the bilirubin is digested, or chemical things happen to the bilirubin that causes it to change, some of it becomes urobilinogen and leaves through the kidneys, but the rest of it becomes a compound known as stercobilin. And stercobilin is a brown compound. So the reason your poop is brown is because of this guy right here, stercobilin, a compound that's left behind in the process of poop processing. There. So, variations in the digestive system. Digestive tracts of all organisms aren't the same. We have mostly looked at human digestive tracts, but we looked earlier at birds that had those crops and gizzards, those specialized stomachs. Other organisms have complex digestive tracts that have parts that we don't have, or maybe they're missing parts that we have. The reason behind this is because of the food that those organisms eat. Generally speaking, form dictates function. Humans eat lots of different types of food, so we need to have different structures in order to be able to process it. Maybe a cow only eats grass, only grazes on plant substances, so they don't need the sharp teeth that we have, but they need the mechanisms inside of them to be able to digest cellulose, to digest the hard sugars that we can't eat. So herbivores, generally speaking, have longer digestive tracts, like physically longer digestive tracts. If you were to stretch them out into a single line, they would be longer than ours. And that's because it takes a long time to be able to digest cellulose. Cellulose, again, sugar that's found in plants. This plant sugar can't be digested by humans. If we eat cellulose, it comes out the other end the same way we ate it. If you eat celery, which contains a lot of cellulose, then we call it fiber because it makes it from one end to the other basically looking the same. Herbivores also have modifications in their digestive tract in order to enhance actual chemical digestion of plant material. And I think of a picture here. So we've got two different types of herbivores, a ruminant and a non-ruminant herbivore. This just refers to the complexity of their stomach. So this rabbit right here is a non-ruminant. It's got an esophagus and a stomach just like we do. But you'll notice its small intestine is pretty long. It actually is a very large cecum, a very large beginning of its large intestine. Then it has a large colon, a long colon or large intestine that eventually ends in its anus. Ruminants are special types of herbivores that have complex four-chambered stomachs. If I could highlight that. Ruminant herbivores are herbivores with four-chambered stomachs that have a large rumen. That's one of the chambers of their four-chambered stomach. And they also have a long, small intestine and a big cecum, and then a long, large intestine. In fact, this organism, this, I guess, deer or buck, elk, whatever it is that has antlers, has a spiral-shaped large intestine just to increase the amount of length it can fit in its body of large intestine. If you compare that to, say, this fox here, this fox has a stomach, pretty short small intestine, pretty short large intestine. Same with this insectivore. I don't know exactly what kind of insectivore it is. Could be a vole. It's got a short small intestine, short large intestine. It doesn't even have a cecum, whereas these guys have large cecums in order to accommodate the types of foods that they eat. So different types of organisms that have different food preferences, herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, have different digestive systems as a result. Now, so with the bacteria that we were talking about earlier, again, the large intestine is layered in bacteria. All mammals rely on intestinal bacteria for some function. Like for us, we need our bacteria in order to synthesize vitamin K. We can't synthesize vitamin K by ourselves. And vitamin K is important. It plays a role in the clotting cascade. Basically, if you have a cut inside of a blood vessel, you would bleed out unless we manage to make a scab or a clot. And part of the clotting process involves vitamin K. So in order to keep us alive, we need vitamin K. So that's a useful function of these intestinal bacteria. Birds don't have these bacteria inside of them, and so they have to consume this essential amount of vitamin K in their diets in order to not bleed out. Poor birds.